All right, welcome back to the deep dive. Today, we're going to be digging into something that's super fundamental to anyone who spends time in the gym, but it's often kind of glossed over. Like, we don't talk about the science behind it in much detail.
Mhm.
And that is how fast you move the weight during resistance training.
Yeah,
So, the speed of your reps.
absolutely.
We're going to be exploring how that affects your gains. And to do that, we've dug up this really comprehensive scientific review. It's
Yeah.
from the PMC database, and it really meticulously goes through and dissects how how the speed affects both your muscle strength and, that muscle growth, hypertrophy, those gains that we're all after.
Precisely. I think a lot of the focus is on the load, how much weight you're moving,
Yeah.
the number of reps that you can perform with that. But this review really highlights that the how, the
Yeah.
way you lift the weight, the
Mm.
speed of each phase of that lift, both the lowering and the lifting,
hmm
that's a real critical lever that you can pull. It's not just about getting the weight up, it's about how you get it up.
Absolutely. And that's what we're going to be unpacking today. For you listening, the goal here is to leave with a really clear, evidence-based understanding of how adjusting your movement tempo, doing it strategically, doing it with intention can actually have a huge impact on your resistance training outcomes.
Right.
Whether your goal is strength or size, we're going to be talking about both. And we're moving beyond gym folklore and bro science. We are diving deep into the research here.
Absolutely. So I think, why don't we start by just laying down a common language here?
Yeah.
How do we talk about this? So the review details how movement tempo is typically described using a sequence of four numbers. Could you walk us through that a little bit?
Yeah, so you might see like a tempo written out as 2030.
Okay.
And what that means is that first number, the 2-1 in this case, signifies the duration in seconds for the eccentric phase, the muscle lengthening phase of the exercise.
Yeah.
Lowering the weight during a bicep curl, for example.
Right. So it's that lowering portion.
Exactly.
Yeah.
The second number, the 0 here, indicates any pause or transition at the bottom of the movement.
Got it.
So, if you're going to pause at the bottom of a squat or at the bottom of a bench press.
Right.
The third number, the 3-pit in this case, represents the concentric phase. That's the muscle shortening or the lifting part.
Okay.
And the final A0 is any pause or transition at the top of the movement before you begin the next rep.
I see. Okay. So we've got the eccentric, the pause at the bottom, concentric, pause at the top.
Mhm.
And we're quantifying this. We're counting in seconds
Yep.
how long these phases take.
Exactly. And that's how tempo is usually written out. So when you see these four numbers, now you know exactly what they mean.
Makes sense. Makes sense. Now, what I think is particularly interesting is this concept of intentionality. Like, are you controlling this tempo or is it just happening? Can you expand on that?
Yeah, that's a great point. So an unintentionally slow tempo might occur, let's say when the weight's just super heavy. You're grinding out those last few reps.
Yeah.
Or as you get fatigued towards the end of a set, you're not really choosing to slow down. The weight is just forcing you to slow down.
Right, right. It's being dictated by the difficulty.
Yeah, but an intentional slow tempo, this is where you're actually consciously regulating the speed of the lift, often with a lighter load. And the review points out that we generally have better control, like voluntary control, over the eccentric, the lowering part of the lift.
Interesting. Why do you think that is?
It seems like our muscles are actually, we can handle more weight eccentrically than concentrically, and maybe that gives us a bit more control during that lowering phase.
That's fascinating. And then, so how does this manipulation of tempo, whether it's intentional or not, how does that actually affect all those training variables that we're kind of tracking in the gym?
Right. It definitely has a pretty significant effect on a bunch of things. So if you slow down each repetition, you're probably going to find that you can't complete as many total reps with a given weight. Like if you're doing a really slow tempo bench press, you're probably not going to be able to do as many reps as if you were doing it at a more moderate pace.
Right.
And of course, it dramatically changes your time under tension, your TUT, that total amount of time that your muscles are under strain during a set.
Right.
And then, as you might imagine, if you're using a really slow tempo, you might need to use a lighter weight in order to complete all of your reps. So tempo, reps, TUT, and load, these are all interconnected pieces of the puzzle.
Yeah, that's really helpful to kind of frame all of those relationships. I think what most people are interested in is how does movement tempo impact hypertrophy, that muscle growth, all those gains we're looking for.
Right.
So what's the idea? Why would slower tempos be more conducive to growing bigger muscles?
Yeah, well, the idea is pretty intuitive, right? If you're going slower, your muscles are under tension for a longer period of time. So the thinking is that This extended tension, it leads to greater muscle fiber recruitment, maybe more microtrauma to the muscle fibers, and it could even lead to a stronger anabolic response, like a more powerful signal to your body to build new muscle tissue.
So it's that time under tension, that TUT. That's the thought process behind it.
Yeah, it makes sense, right? More time under tension, more stimulus for growth.
It does, but as the review carefully points out, the evidence isn't always clear-cut. There
Yeah.
seems to be conflicting findings out there. What have you gathered from that?
Yeah, that's right. Like even the American College of Sports Medicine, the ACSM, they offer these general tempo guidelines based on experience level. So they might say, slower to moderate tempos are better for beginners, and then more advanced individuals can have more variability. They can play around with it more. But as this review points out, those are pretty broad strokes, and they don't really delve into the specifics of, what's the optimal length of the eccentric phase versus the concentric phase.
Right, right. Okay, so the ACSM, they're giving us some general guidelines, but it's not very precise.
Exactly.
So let's look at some of the studies then. The review, the first one they mentioned, is Tanamoto and Ishii from 2006. What did they find with regards to hypertrophy and tempo?
So this study, it focused on knee extensions, and it was with untrained individuals.
Okay.
They compared a slower tempo, so they had a group doing 31:30, which is a pretty slow, deliberate tempo, and they had them use a lighter load, 50% of their 1 rep max, their 1 RM.
Okay.
And they compared that group to a faster tempo group, a 11:10 tempo group, and this group was also using 50% of their 1 RM.
Okay, so same weight, different speeds.
Exactly.
hmm
They also had a third group, a fast tempo group, using a much heavier weight, 80% of their 1 RM.
Yep.
And what they found, and this is kind of surprising, was that the slower tempo group, the one using the lighter weight, actually had greater muscle growth than the fast tempo group using the same lighter weight.
So just slowing down the tempo led to more growth, even though they were using a lighter weight.
Yeah, it seems like to some extent you can compensate for using a lighter weight by just slowing down your reps. And what's even more interesting is that the hypertrophy in the slower tempo group, the one using 50% of their 1 RM, it was basically the same as the hypertrophy seen in the fast tempo group that was using 80% of their 1 RM.
Wow, so that's pretty significant. That tells us that a slower tempo, even with a lighter weight, can be really effective for hypertrophy.
Hmm.
What about the next study, the 2008 study by Tanamoto et al., where they looked at whole body training?
Yeah, so in this one, they saw a similar trend, but this time it was across a range of exercises, a full body workout. They had one group using a slower tempo with a lighter load, around 55–60% of their 1 RM, and another group doing a faster tempo with a heavier load, 80–90% of their 1 RM. And guess what? They found similar amounts of muscle growth in both groups.
So again, even though the weights were drastically different, the slower tempo with the lighter weight led to similar muscle growth as the faster tempo with the heavier weight.
Right. So this isn't just some quirk that's specific to knee extensions. It seems to be a more general phenomenon.
That's really interesting. It seems to be supporting this idea that slowing down the tempo can be really beneficial for hypertrophy. But then the review brings up this 2012 study by Schwenke et al., and kind of throws a wrench in the works. What did you make of that one?
Yeah, this is where things get a little more complicated. So Shrink and his team, they actually found that a faster tempo, specifically 2010, at a pretty high intensity, 80–85% of 1 RM, this faster tempo actually led to greater muscle fiber growth than a much slower tempo. They had another group doing 40–100, so a really slow, controlled tempo, but at a lighter weight, 40–60% 1 RM.
So this is kind of the opposite of what we saw in the previous two studies. Here, the faster tempo led to more growth, even though the slower tempo had much more time under tension.
Exactly, and it kind of challenges this simple idea that more TUT automatically equals more muscle growth. There's clearly something else going on. It might be the intensity of the load. It might be the specific demands placed on the muscle during those different phases of the contraction, but it's definitely more complex than just TUT.
Yeah, it definitely highlights the complexity of hypertrophy. It's not just one variable. It's this interplay of different factors. And then the review goes on to look at studies that really zoom in on the eccentric and concentric phases specifically. So let's start with Nogura's 2009 study.
Okay, so Nogre's team, they were specifically interested in the speed of the lifting portion, the concentric part of the movement. They had subjects doing bicep curls and leg presses, One group was doing a 30-10 tempo, so a pretty fast concentric, and the other group was doing a 30-30, so much slower concentric. And they found that the faster lifting speed, that 30-10 group, it actually resulted in more bicep growth, but there was no significant difference in the rectus femoris, which is one of the quadriceps muscles.
So the speed of the concentric contraction, the lifting phase, mattered for the bicep but not for the quad. That's really interesting. Why do you think the muscle group mattered there?
Yeah, it's a good question. It could be that different muscles respond differently to tempo manipulations. Maybe it has to do with the fiber type composition of the muscle, or maybe it's something about the specific movement patterns, like how the muscle is being used during the exercise.
That's a good point. And then we have Pereira's 2016 study, which focused on the lowering the eccentric tempo.
Right. So Pereira and his team, they had people doing bicep curls, and they were comparing a 40-10 tempo, so slower eccentric, to a 10-10 tempo, which is a faster eccentric. And what they found was that the slower eccentric, the 4-second lowering phase, it led to greater bicep growth compared to the faster eccentric.
Okay. So that kind of emphasizes the importance of that controlled lowering phase for muscle development, at least in this specific exercise.
Yeah, it seems like that slow, controlled eccentric might be a key driver of hypertrophy, potentially by causing more muscle damage, which then triggers a stronger growth response.
Makes sense. Then there's the 2006 study by Gillies et al., and they did something really clever. They kept the total TUT the same, but varied how that time was distributed between the eccentric and the concentric.
Yeah, so Gillies and her team, they had two groups of trained women. One group did reps with a 60-20 tempo, so slow eccentric, fast concentric, and the other group did 20-60, so fast eccentric, slow concentric. And what they found was that both tempos led to increases in muscle fiber area, but there was no statistically significant difference between the two groups. So it seems like the total TUT might be more important than how that time is distributed, at least in this context.
That's really interesting, and it kind of throws another variable into the mix. So we've got this interplay between total TUT and then the distribution of that TUT between eccentric and concentric.
Right, it's not a simple answer, is it?
It's not. So if we try to pull all of these findings together, what's the big picture here regarding hypertrophy and tempo? What should people who are listening, what should they walk away with?
Okay, so it doesn't seem like either super slow or super fast tempos are the magic bullet for maximizing muscle growth. What the review really points to is this idea that a combination might be the most effective. Specifically, a slower, more controlled eccentric phase, that lowering phase, paired with a faster, more powerful concentric phase, that lifting phase.
So it's not just about slowing everything down, it's about controlling that lowering portion and then lifting with more intent.
Exactly. And for you listening, it really highlights the importance of thinking about each phase of the lift, not just the overall speed of the rep.
And that makes sense if we think about the potential mechanisms, right? A slower eccentric, it could cause more muscle damage, more metabolic stress, which are some of the drivers of muscle growth.
Yeah.
And then a faster concentric, it could allow you to recruit those higher threshold muscle fibers that might not be fully activated during slower movements.
Right, you're getting the best of both
That's
worlds.
exactly.
But the review does remind us that tempo isn't the only factor, right?
Mm.
You still need to pay attention to your load, how much weight you're lifting, your volume, how many sets and reps you're doing, and whether you're pushing yourself close to failure. Tempo is just another tool in the toolbox.
Right, it's another variable that you can manipulate to optimize your training. Absolutely. So now let's shift gears a little bit and talk about how tempo influences maximal strength.
Yeah.
Is it a similar story to what we saw with hypertrophy?
So the review points out that strength gains are very specific to the type of training that you're doing. And when it comes to tempo, there was this 2017 meta-analysis by Davies et al., and they actually found no statistically significant difference in strength gains between training with fast versus slow tempos. But that meta-analysis had some limitations, didn't it?
It did, yeah. It was primarily comparing explosive or fast movements to slower ones. I wasn't really diving deep into eccentric durations, concentric durations.
Yeah.
So let's look at some of the individual studies that they pull out for strength. What about Munn et al. Back in 2005?
Yeah, so Munn's research, which was on bicep curls, they found slightly greater strength gains with a faster tempo, specifically a 10-10 tempo compared to a slower tempo, 20-20.
Okay.
But the review is careful to point out that this was a single joint exercise, and the actual difference in strength gained was pretty small, so it might not be that meaningful for more complex multi-joint movements.
Right. So maybe not the most generalizable finding.
Yeah.
Okay, what about the studies that looked at more moderate tempo variations, within that 2-3 second range?
So most of those studies, and there's a bunch of them, Morrissey et al., Watanabe et al., Bataro et al., they generally found no significant differences in strength gains between these relatively small tempo adjustments.
Okay, so if you're just tweaking the tempo a little bit, it might not have a huge impact on your maximal strength.
Right. It seems like those minor variations might not be that important in the grand scheme of things.
What about the studies that look at more extreme differences in tempo, like Schwenke et al., which we talked about earlier, or Niels et al.?
Yeah, so even with those larger temper differences, they didn't really find any consistent, significant differences in strength gains.
Hmm.
But there was this 2001 study by Keeler et al. That kind of throws a wrench in things again.
Oh, okay. What happened there?
So Keeler's team, they found that a faster tempo, specifically a 40-20 tempo, was more effective for increasing strength than a slower tempo, which was 5100 in certain exercises. And this was even though the slower tempo group had a much greater total time under tension.
So again, it seems like TUT isn't the only factor determining strength adaptations. There's something about that faster tempo that might be beneficial for strength.
Yeah, and it might have to do with the neural adaptations that are needed for strength gains. Like maybe training with a faster tempo helps you improve your rate of force development, which is how quickly you can generate force, and that's crucial for moving heavy weight.
Makes sense.
Hmm.
And then to further complicate things, Westcott et al. In 2001, they actually found a slightly greater increase in strength with a slower concentric movement, 4,100 compared to a faster one, 40-21.
Right, and if we go back to Pereira's 2016 study, which showed greater muscle growth with the slower eccentric phase, they also found greater strength gains with the slower eccentric tempo, 40-10, compared to the faster one, 10-10. So there are definitely some conflicting findings when it comes to tempo and strength.
Yeah, it seems like the research on tempo and strength is just less clear-cut than it is for hypertrophy. So, like, big picture, what's the conclusion?
The review concludes that, as of right now, the research doesn't strongly favor one specific tempo over another for maximizing strength. But there is this idea that faster training might be more effective for those neural adaptations that are essential for strength gains,
Hmm.
and controlled slower eccentrics might still offer some benefits, especially for certain exercises or muscle groups. And it's important to remember when you're training with really heavy loads, like 80, 100% of your 1RM, the speed of the lift, that concentric phase, is naturally going to be slower.
Hmm.
You can't really lift super heavy weight super fast.
Right, right. That makes sense. And it brings up this really important point about how we even measure our strength, like how we assess our 1RM and then use that to base our training percentages off of.
Yeah, that's a big limitation that the review highlights. So typically when you do a 1RM test, you're performing it at your maximal voluntary speed.
Mhm.
You're trying to move that weight as fast as possible. But if you're then going to train with significantly different tempos, the actual percentage of your true 1RM that you're working at might not be accurate. Like if you're doing a really slow tempo, you might not actually be able to lift your true 1RM at that tempo.
Right, that makes sense. It's like the 1RM test isn't specific to the tempo you're going to train at.
Exactly. So it becomes difficult to really know how hard you're working based on your 1RM if you're using different tempos.
Yeah, it highlights the need for like a more precise way of talking about and using tempo in training programs.
Hmm.
And actually, the review does propose a new classification system for how long each phase of the movement lasts.
Oh, yeah, they do.
So can you walk us through that?
Yeah, so they suggest categorizing the movement phases based on the duration in seconds. So they call explosive EX anything less than 3 seconds.
Okay.
Fast F is 1 to 2.9 seconds. Medium M is 3 to 5.9 seconds. Slow S is 6 to 9.9 seconds. And then anything 10 seconds or longer is considered extremely slow.
ES, so EXFMSES. This is a much more precise way of defining our tempo.
Right, it gives us a more standardized language to use.
And based on this new classification system, the review goes on to give some specific guidelines for optimal total time under tension per set, depending on your training goals.
They do. So for strength development, they suggest a TUT per set of 2 to 20 seconds, with the individual phases being ideally in the fast, explosive, medium fast, or medium explosive categories.
Okay.
And then for those who are looking for both strength and hypertrophy, they recommend a slightly longer TUT, 20 to 40 seconds per set.
Mm.
And that allows for a bit of a broader range of tempo combinations. And then for maximizing hypertrophy, they suggest a TUT of 40 to 70 seconds per set, often incorporating slower and even extremely slow eccentrics with those faster concentrics.
So we've got these ranges for total time under tension, depending on what we're trying to achieve.
Right.
And the review also points out how significantly varying your tempo can affect your total TUT for your entire workout.
Yeah, they give examples showing that using slower tempos can actually more than double your total TUT for the same exercises, sets, and reps compared to faster tempos.
Wow, so it's not just affecting the TUT of a single set, it's affecting the overall training stress of your entire workout.
Exactly, and that's something to keep in mind when you're planning your training and thinking about recovery.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
Now, this is interesting. The review also talks about this idea of varying the tempo within and even between sets. Have you played around with that at all?
Yeah, they mentioned this idea of slow-fast supersets, where you alternate between sets with slower tempos and sets with faster tempos.
Okay.
And they also talk about varying the tempo within a single set, like maybe slowing down the last few reps of a set.
Hmm.
The idea is that this might allow you to reap the benefits of both slower and faster contractions, but they do caution that this kind of variation might reduce the specificity of your training adaptations. Like, if you want to be really good at lifting heavy weight fast, you should probably train that way most of the time.
Makes sense.
Yeah.
And what about, are there any specific situations or populations where slower tempos might be particularly beneficial?
Yeah, so the review suggests that slower tempos can be really good for improving movement control and stability, which is especially important for younger individuals who are still developing their coordination, people who are rehabbing injuries, or even during active recovery sessions where you're not really trying to push the intensity.
Okay, so slower tempos, more control, more stability.
Exactly.
And the review actually gives a real-world example of how this is all applied using a powerlifter's bench press program.
Yeah, it's a cool example. It shows how, even at that elite level, athletes are strategically using tempo variations in their training. You can see how they have sessions that focus on faster, more explosive movements, and then sessions that incorporate those really slow eccentrics. And it's all planned out to help them achieve their strength goals.
Right, it's not just random. There's thought and strategy behind it.
Yeah, it's another level of thinking about your training.
Absolutely. And of course, we have to acknowledge the limitations of the research, right? There's always more to learn. What are some of the areas where we need more research?
They point out that there's not a lot of research on specific populations, like older adults, recreational athletes, and competitive athletes in various sports.
Hmm.
And it's kind of ironic because those are the groups that could probably benefit the most from a deeper understanding of tempo.
Yeah, totally.
And there's not a ton of data on heavy load, low rep training with varying tempos specifically for strength. And as we discussed before, it gets pretty tough to intentionally control the tempo when you're working with really heavy weight or when you're going all out on those concentric reps.
Yeah.
And then that other limitation we talked about, that the 1RM testing in these studies often wasn't specific to the tempo that they were testing, that's something that future research should really try to address.
Right, right. So as we kind of wrap this up, what are the big takeaway points for our listeners today?
So the main thing is that movement tempo is a crucial variable in your training. It can have a big impact on both your muscle growth and your strength gains, but there isn't one right answer for everyone.
Well,
The best approach depends on your individual goals, your training experience, and probably even the specific exercise you're doing.
and for muscle growth, it seems like a slower, controlled eccentric phase with a faster concentric phase is generally a good approach.
Exactly. And while the picture is less clear for strength, it seems like faster training might be good for those neural adaptations, while controlled eccentrics might have some additional benefits.
So the key is to be intentional, to be mindful of your tempo, and to experiment to see what works best for you.
Right. So here's something to think about for your next workout. Pay attention to that lowering phase, that eccentric phase of your lifts. Try slowing it down, controlling it, and see how it feels. See how it impacts your muscles both during and after your workout. And remember those TUT recommendations we talked about. Think about whether you're primarily training for strength, hypertrophy, or both, and adjust your tempos accordingly. Thanks for joining us on the deep dive today.